The tale of one of ancient Rome's most significant uprisings under the leadership of Spartacus continues to captivate audiences to this day. Very little is known about Spartacus's life as a gladiator, and even less is known about the circumstances under which he became a slave. This is primarily because all sources about the uprising were written by one side of the conflict, namely the free citizens of Rome, and apparently they did not see the need to describe which slaves came from what background and who they were before slavery, and so on. Ancient authors perceived the uprising primarily as a disruption of social order, which it generally was. There were no noble intentions among the rebels, and certainly no codes of honor, unlike in the series where Spartacus outright refuses to kill captured Romans, reflects on the value of human life, and condemns looting.
And I will not see us become the very thing we fight against.
The attitude towards the uprising underwent a dramatic shift in historical terms relatively recently. One of the first to speak positively about the uprising was the French philosopher Voltaire. He dubbed the uprising as the only truly just war in human history. Then in 1874, the Italian writer Raffaello Giovagnoli wrote the magnificent, albeit heavily detached from reality novel Spartacus. In this novel, the slave's political consciousness and awareness are overly exaggerated. During that era, slaves did not and could not rebel against the slaveholding system. Their aim was merely personal emancipation and enrichment through looting settlements and cities. However, in Giovagnoli's novel, the slaves, particularly Spartacus himself, expressed thoughts on slavery that might have crossed Giovagnoli's mind but would not have occurred to a Roman slave in the 1st century BC. Many Hollywood films about Spartacus, and of course the series Spartacus, borrowed these enlightened ideas about overthrowing an unjust social system from Giovagnoli's novel. We will return to Giovagnoli's novel later in our analysis because many plot lines, which were far from reality, were clearly inspired by the works of the 19th century writer. Little is known about Spartacus himself, but some fragments of his story have survived. The common belief is that he was Thracian. In support of this, it's often cited that the Thracians commonly used a name similar to Spartacus, which could have eventually evolved into Spartacus. Additionally, the works of the Roman writer Florus have been preserved in which he claimed that Spartacus was a mercenary from Thrace. But it's worth considering that Florus lived 100 years after the slave uprising. There are two main versions of how Spartacus became a slave. The first version, he fought against the Romans, was captured and sold into slavery as a gladiator. If this version is true, it likely occurred in 83 BC, at the beginning of the Second Mithridatic War. The second version, Spartacus initially served in auxiliary Thracian units of the Roman army, then deserted, but was captured and enslaved. This could have happened during one of Rome's Thracian wars. The second version was chosen for adaptation in the series. Of course, unlike in the series, Spartacus had no conflict with Gaius Claudius Glaber because the praetor didn't send his wife into slavery. The storyline of Spartacus seeking revenge for his slain wife is fabricated. It's known that in reality, Spartacus had a separate room where he lived with his wife. The plot line of his wife being killed and captured by the praetor was added for drama and to ignite conflict between Spartacus and Glaber during the early seasons. The fact that Spartacus had a separate room in the ludus indicates that he was a skilled gladiator, beloved by the audience, and indeed successful in Batiatus's gladiator school in Capua. However, it's worth noting that in reality, there were many such separate rooms in luduses for the best gladiators. So Spartacus was likely one of the good gladiators in Capua rather than the absolute best. In the series, as you may recall, the lion's share of the first season is dedicated to the owner of Ludus, to Batiatus.
Rain, by Jupiter's cult, would you fucking rain?
What are you doing?
Praying.
One of the main plot lines revolves around Batiatus's ambition to attain a level of power beyond his father's dreams. In pursuit of this goal, he spares no effort to ascend to the Senate, eliminating anyone who dares obstruct his path. However, in reality, due to the nature of his profession, Batiatus could never aspire to become a senator. Lanistas, the owners of gladiatorial schools, were not esteemed members of society, and the path to high politics was entirely closed to them. Another primary plot line of the first season centers around the training of the gladiators and their performances in the arena. Before earning the right to bear the mark of the Brotherhood, they had to undergo a trial by combat against a seasoned gladiator from the school. Moreover, prior to facing off against a more experienced opponent, recruits were subjected to starvation. In reality, of course, such practices would not have occurred. Slaves were considered property, and gladiators were among the most valuable. School owners understood the importance of investing in their assets and strictly monitored their nutrition. It would have been financially unwise to throw gladiators into certain death without preparation, and any such scenario would have required substantial compensation to justify the loss of such valuable assets. In the series, there is a frequent tendency to underestimate the value of slaves, particularly gladiators. For instance, in the 8th episode, Batiatus purchases 6 slaves in excellent physical condition at auction for 100 denarii, and it is suggested that he overpaid. In reality, the price for an ordinary slave without any exceptional skills usually started at 400 denarii. The prices for skilled slaves, such as an artisan, could reach several thousand denarii. The most valued slaves were Greek philosophers, young beautiful female slaves, and gladiators. To provide some context for these prices, let's look to the records of salaries in the Roman army during the time of Octavian Augustus. The annual salary of a centurion primipalus, roughly equivalent to a modern-day colonel, was 3,250 denarii. A regular legionary received an annual salary of 225 denarii. This means that ordinary non-aristocratic Romans could at best save up enough in their lifetime to buy a slave who would help with the harvest in the field or with household chores. Of course, prices could decrease during major conquests because new slaves were brought to Rome from newly acquired territories, increasing the supply and driving prices down. However, slaves with valuable skills always remained highly prized. The life of a gladiator was marked by relentless training. Their regimen included general physical exercises focused primarily on endurance and strength, as well as intensive combat skills training. These training sessions were rigorous, stretching from morning until night. Although not depicted in the series, gladiators were trained in swordsmanship using specially designed wooden swords that were twice as heavy as regular swords. This method ensured that, in real combat, a standard weight sword would feel much lighter and easier to handle. Furthermore, gladiatorial combat was primarily a spectacle, a form of entertainment. It wasn't enough to merely win. Gladiators had to do so with style to captivate the Roman audience. While the series shows that the gladiators, especially Gannicus, understood this well, in reality, this process wasn't left to chance because they didn't assume that gladiators would figure it out on their own.
The task should not be that difficult. I need only direct my blades towards the smell of shit.
Gladiatorial schools employed specialists who taught the fighters at least the basics of performance, how to strike a pose after a victory, how to greet the crowd, and more. A successful gladiator was one who earned substantial revenue for his master, and for that, he needed to be beloved by the crowd. Lanista Proximo would certainly agree.
I wasn't the best because I killed quickly. I was the best because the crowd loved me.
Additionally, Luduses did not rely on a single all-purpose trainer for every aspect of training. Instead, there was at least one specialized trainer for each type of gladiator, ensuring that each fighter received focused and appropriate training for their specific combat style. Spartacus, for example, likely fought in the style of a Thracian. Originally, Thracians were chosen based on their ethnicity, being from the people of Thrace. But over time, the term came to be associated solely with their equipment, regardless of the fighter's nationality. A Thracian gladiator was equipped with large greaves, armor for the forearm, a sika, Thracian curved sword, a small shield, and a large helmet. The series costume designers paid meticulous attention to the different classes of gladiators, and all the equipment accurately matches their respective types. There is no historical evidence that Spartacus fought as a Dimacherus, as depicted in the series after his victory over Theocles, but if he had, he would have used two curved swords or daggers. In the series, Crixus fights as a Murmilon. A Murmilon was armed with a gladius and protected by a scutum, a large rectangular shield, a manica, armor for the right forearm, and a large helmet. According to the plot, Barca was also trained as a Murmilon but preferred to fight with a spear. It's worth noting that Barca couldn't have witnessed the fall of Carthage, as it happened 70 years before Spartacus's uprising. In the 7th episode of the first season, Spartacus kills the gladiator Gnaeus, who fought as a Retiarius, which translates from Latin as net fighter. These gladiators eschewed armor to facilitate precise net throwing. Their tactic was straightforward: ensnare opponents with the net and then calmly dispatch them with the trident. Additionally, if unable to ensnare their foe, a Retiarius employed the net to disarm their opponent, snatching the weapon from their enemy. Retiarii were very popular in the 1st century BC, during the time of Spartacus's rebellion. Shortly after, to counter the Retiarius, a new class of gladiator known as the Secutor was introduced. Evolving from the Murmilons, who wielded a gladius and a large rectangular shield, Secutors were distinguished by their unique helmets. These helmets were round and smooth, covering the entire face except for 2 eye holes. This design prevented them from being caught in the net and protected their face from the sharp trident. In the series, there is a strong focus on the immoral lifestyle in Rome, with constant scenes of sex and drinking. The Roman Empire was essentially a system where the wealth of the known world flowed into a single city, making it perhaps the richest city in human history to that point. And as is well known, wealth tends to corrupt. Most historians agree that the richer Rome became, the more it was characterized by debauchery, lust, and drunkenness. However, the Spartacus uprising took place during the Roman Republic, almost half a century before Rome became an empire under Octavian Augustus. Republican Rome, compared to imperial Rome, was marked by greater restraint and stricter morals. It's important to emphasize that this is in comparison to imperial Rome, not to today's moral standards. For example, during the Republic, drunkenness among women was frowned upon, and women could not appear naked at gladiatorial games. The sodomy depicted in the series is more reflective of the imperial period, where events at banquets could be even more outrageous than those shown in the series. In ancient Rome, there were no nightclubs or luxurious restaurants. There was simply no need for them. Parties and feasts were hosted in the homes of the elite, much like what is depicted in the series. A lavish party at a wealthy Roman's house promised an array of exotic or unusual dishes, such as pig's udders, sheep's brains, and other peculiar animal organs. Naturally, any good party was adorned with female and male strippers, who by the middle of the event would have sex with the Roman nobility after shedding their clothes. The higher the status of a Roman, the more refined and extravagant the pleasures expected at their parties. For instance, Emperor Nero enjoyed hosting drunken chariot races in his garden, while Emperor Domitian would hunt lions during banquets without leaving his villa. Some Romans, however, had such dulled dopamine receptors that they sought even more extreme forms of entertainment. One particular type of pleasure among the wealthy was visiting the dirtiest and most sordid dens of Rome. Historian Garrett Ryan, in his book, provides an example of one such outing. The scheme was as follows. A patrician would dress as an unremarkable city dweller, take a bag of gold coins and a couple of guards disguised as plebeians. The bodyguards would follow at a distance, keeping watch outside while the patrician entered a seedy establishment filled with notorious criminals. Inside, the patrician would flaunt his gold, gamble with swindlers, and after losing a bit, leave. Naturally, a gang of thieves would follow, hoping to snatch the gold. The supposed victim would lead them into a dark alley where his guards would be waiting. The patrician would then relish the sight of the plebeians being beaten nearly to death. Such perverse pleasures were the only way for some wealthy Romans to liven up their days. However, it is important to note that this behavior is more reflective of the imperial period. In the series, and generally in all films about him, Spartacus is depicted as leading the uprising from the outset, during the planning stages. Specifically, in this series, Spartacus initially plans to escape with his wife, and it is only her death that delays his escape. In reality, it is difficult to determine exactly when he became the leader of the uprising, especially if we try to rely on sources that are at least somewhat credible. The two main narratives about Spartacus, which form the basis of all modern books and articles about the uprising, are the works of Appian and Plutarch. They differ in their opinions regarding the extent to which Spartacus led the escape and the subsequent uprising. For Appian, he was the ringleader who convinced the gladiators to flee. For Plutarch, he became a leader only after the escape. However, even these so-called reliable sources raise many questions. To begin with, the works of Appian and Plutarch were written a century after the Spartacus uprising. The reliability of the sources they used is also questionable. Most of Spartacus's followers either died in battle or were crucified along the Appian way, making it difficult to understand how an accurate depiction of Spartacus could be created without speaking to those who spent the last years with him. Incidentally, the Spartacus uprising was not the first slave revolt. Ancient authors referred to it as the Third Servile War, never specifically as the Spartacus uprising. Prior to this, revolts had erupted twice in Sicily, in 135 and 104 BC. The spark for the Third Servile War, or what we now call the Spartacus Rebellion, could have been the news of upcoming games where gladiators were to be purifying sacrifices for the Roman people, meaning they would all be killed in the arena. This detail is missing from the series, but in reality, Batiatus's school specialized in acquiring problematic slaves in large numbers who could be sacrificed without much regret. Naturally, the owner was well compensated for such sacrifices, so he didn't object. However, the gladiators were far less willing to offer themselves up as sacrifices. As we remember from the series, by the end of the first season, Batiatus was deeply engrossed in his political ambitions, neglecting his gladiator school. This led to a shocking moment when his most trusted gladiator, Spartacus, appeared on the second floor of his villa in front of all his guests, with a sword in his hand. In reality, as mentioned earlier, Batiatus could not have pursued a political career and was fully dedicated to his ludus. In fact, Batiatus learned about the planned escape in advance. But despite this, some of the gladiators managed to arm themselves with kitchen skewers and knives, overpower the guards, and break free from Capua. The group of rebels headed towards Vesuvius, capturing several wagons of gladiatorial weapons along the way. This is where the first season ends and the second begins. Most of the events in the second season have little to do with reality. In my opinion, the second season turned out to be weaker than the first. The reason for this is that Andy Whitfield, who played the lead role of Spartacus in the first season, was diagnosed with cancer. The creators of the project hoped for his return, so the filming of the continuation was delayed for a long time. To keep the audience's interest, the producers even released a prequel. Unfortunately, Andy passed away in 2011 at the age of 39. Due to these delays, some other team members, not just actors, were also replaced, which inevitably affected the quality. At the beginning of the second season, the escaped gladiators are shown living in the sewers. Although it isn't explicitly mentioned in the series, It can be assumed that these sewers are located somewhere near Capua, judging by the fact that the gladiators constantly walk around the town. This raises the question of how hundreds of drunken, shouting slaves living in these sewers managed to go unnoticed. In reality, the location of the escaped slaves was well known. The gladiators immediately moved far away from Capua and did not hide in sewers. Their first base was the summit of Mount Vesuvius. From there, they raided Roman villas, capturing more weapons and armor in skirmishes with small groups of Roman soldiers. Runaway slaves from nearby towns began to join their ranks, and their numbers grew rapidly. The second season features constant clashes between Spartacus and Praetor Glaber. In the series, Glaber takes over the looted ludus after its owner Batiatus is killed. However, in reality, Batiatus survived, continued to run his ludus, and even outlived Spartacus. Additionally, the series depicts Lucretia, Batiatus's wife, mysteriously surviving the carnage at the ludus and being appointed by Glaber as a haruspex, a priestess who divines the future by inspecting the entrails of sacrificial animals. This could never have happened in reality. Becoming a haruspex required being a member of the College of Priests and undergoing special training. Moreover, all appointments of haruspex had to be confirmed by the Senate, ensuring the seer's qualifications. Supernatural matters were taken very seriously at the time, and nothing was left to chance. At the very least, Glaber would have to coordinate the predictions of his haruspex with the Senate before revealing the will of the gods to the people. Gaius Claudius Glaber is remembered in history as the praetor who lost to Spartacus at the Battle of Mount Vesuvius. This occurred mainly because, although Glaber gathered a force of 3,000 men, he did so hastily, which meant his troops were made up of poorly trained soldiers. At that time, the Senate did not take the rebellion of a handful of gladiators seriously, as Rome had its own pressing issues. Rome was engaged in two simultaneous wars. In the west, Pompey the Great was gradually defeating Quintus Sertorius, who was the last supporter of Gaius Marius, and in the east, Lucius Licinius Lucullus was waging a difficult campaign against Mithridates, the king of Pontus. Given these circumstances, the Roman authorities did not see the gladiator and slave uprising as a significant threat. To them, it was just another routine rebellion, the kind that happened frequently in Rome and was not considered unusual. The authorities viewed the insurgents as a band of robbers rather than a serious menace. The depiction of the Battle of Mount Vesuvius in the series is quite accurate. This battle is probably the most well-known example of the resourcefulness shown by the slaves, leading to them being taken more seriously by the Senate. When Glaber reached Vesuvius, he besieged the mountaintop by blocking the only known means of descent. He planned to wait until the lack of food forced the rebels to surrender. Although the slave gladiators were not organized soldiers, they demonstrated remarkable ingenuity by using all available materials. Spartacus's men managed to weave ropes from the grapevines growing all over Vesuvius and used them to descend the cliffs on the opposite side of the mountain. According to the Roman historian Florus, there is another exotic version of the victory at Vesuvius. He claimed that the rebels descended using ropes made of grapevines into the hollow crater of Vesuvius and emerged through a tunnel. After this, as in the official version, the gladiators circled the base of the volcano and attacked Glaber's troops at night. In this way, around 100 gladiators managed to defeat a Roman force which was 3,000 strong. This was primarily because Glaber's troops lacked real combat experience. They had positioned sentries on the mountain descent but had none within the camp itself. In the Battle of Vesuvius, Spartacus demonstrated the core principle of his military strategy, which he successfully used against the Romans: attack the enemy where he least expects it. The Battle of Vesuvius marked the beginning of a full-scale war between escaped gladiators and Rome. After their brilliant victory, the rebels left their positions on the volcano's slope and settled in the former Roman camp. News of Spartacus's victory spread quickly, and his ranks swelled with slaves from nearby cities, villas, and settlements who fled to join his cause. In the series, it's repeatedly mentioned that food in Spartacus's army was shared equally, regardless of status. This is true, at least in the early stages of the uprising. Spartacus was aided in leading the army by 3 Gauls: Crixus, Gannicus, and Oenomaus. In the series, the Gaul Oenomaus appears overly tanned for a Gaul, as Gallia was located in what is now modern-day France. Some sources mistakenly claim that Oenomaus was a German, but this misconception originated from Giovagnoli's novel, which is not reliable due to its numerous historical inaccuracies. It's unclear exactly when Oenomaus died, but he certainly did not survive until the end of the Third Servile War. Most historians believe he did not die nobly in the Battle of Vesuvius as depicted in the series, but later, when the armies of slaves were raiding towns and villages. In the series, Gannicus joins the slaves shortly before the Battle of Vesuvius. According to the plot, Gannicus was a gladiator who had received a rudis, meaning he had earned his freedom. However, driven by guilt over having slept with Oenomaus' wife in the prequel, he joined Spartacus's uprising out of a sense of duty to Oenomaus, and after Oenomaus' death, out of respect for his fallen comrade Gannicus, continued to help Spartacus. In reality, there was no such love triangle, at least according to the most reliable sources. Gaius Gannicus was born in the 2nd century BC. Plutarch believed he was from Gallia, but some historians think that he could have had Celtic roots. Captured and made a gladiator, Gannicus was sold to Lentulus Batiatus' gladiator school in Capua, where he befriended Spartacus. Thus, according to Plutarch, he was already acquainted with Spartacus in the gladiator school and participated in the uprising from the beginning. Plutarch makes no mention of a rudis being granted to Gannicus. However, Plutarch does describe Gannicus as the best gladiator in Capua, so there is some truth in the prequel. Spartacus was well acquainted with the organization and training methods of the Roman army. This knowledge came from either serving in the Roman auxiliary forces or fighting against Roman troops, depending on which version of his pre-slavery life is accurate. He organized the rebel army according to the Roman model. His army was divided into large units of several thousand men, resembling legions. These units were organized by nationality to facilitate easier communication among the warriors. There were units composed of Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Greeks, and Syrians. The rebels spent most of their free time training and practicing command execution. Because of this, Spartacus was able to quickly transform disparate groups of slaves into a capable army that could effectively oppose Roman legions. Initially, Spartacus decided to lead his army north towards the Alps, intending to cross the mountains and allow each of his warriors to live freely. Along the way, the gladiators defeated the Roman commander Publius Varinius several times. In reality, unlike the series, Spartacus's army encountered Varinius after the Battle of Vesuvius. And despite Varinius's army being defeated multiple times, Varinius himself survived. Realizing the seriousness of the threat, the Senate sent 2 consular armies under the command of Gnaeus Lentulus Clodianus and Lucius Gellius Publicola to suppress the rebellion. Each consul led 2 legions, which, along with auxiliaries and cavalry, amounted to about 30,000 men. Auxiliaries were foreign mercenary units in the Roman army. By this time, Spartacus had entrenched himself in southern Italy and captured several cities. The episode depicting the capture of a city aligns with reality. Although the cities were not taken as easily as shown in the film, they were indeed captured. The slave army continually grew. However, unlike the series, which emphasizes that Spartacus only accepted runaway slaves and even features a scene where newcomers are checked for branding, in reality, free people, including impoverished farmers, the urban poor, and fugitive criminals, also joined Spartacus's army. For some reason, the consuls divided their forces. presumably intending to encircle Spartacus's army. Consul Lentulus planned to cross the Apennines directly and move along the Adriatic coast, while Consul Gellius aimed to march through Apulia via the Appian Way. However, thanks to effective reconnaissance, Spartacus learned of the enemy's plans and also divided his army. Crixus, with 10,000 Gauls and Germans, moved to confront Gellius at Mount Garganus, while Spartacus, with 30,000 warriors, aimed to intercept Lentulus's forces. Spartacus's plan was to quickly defeat Lentulus and then aid Crixus, thereby encircling Gellius's army. The first part of Spartacus's plan worked perfectly. He intercepted Lentulus's forces before they could cross the Apennines. Spartacus's light infantry continually harassed Lentulus's 15-kilometer-long column. Eventually, the Romans lost their ability to take effective action and retreated with heavy losses, though they avoided complete destruction. Without pursuing them, Spartacus immediately marched to Garganus to join Crixus. Unfortunately, he arrived just a few hours too late. Crixus's army had been defeated by Gellius's superior forces, and Crixus himself had fallen in battle. Spartacus's army immediately attacked the victorious Romans, inflicting heavy casualties on them. Thus, in reality, Crixus fell in battle even before Crassus was appointed to oppose Spartacus, unlike the series. The episode with the Gladiatorial Games in honor of Spartacus's fallen comrade Crixus did occur in reality, though much earlier in the timeline. Mourning his friend and ally, Spartacus organized grand gladiatorial games at Crixus's funeral pyre, featuring 150 pairs of captured Roman soldiers. This was an unprecedented spectacle at the time, to have captured Roman soldiers fight to the death in the arena. After this, the rebels decided to move north towards the Alps, hoping to return to their native lands. As Spartacus's army advanced, the rebellion spread to new territories, with more people joining the insurgents. It's important to note that a large army needs to be fed multiple times a day. This aspect is often overlooked in modern films and series about Spartacus, but in reality, the rebels not only looted wealthy villas, they also took food and valuables from even the poorest farmers. Near the Alps, Spartacus won another grand victory not depicted in the series. He defeated a 10,000-strong army commanded by Gaius Cassius Longinus, the father of one of Caesar's future assassins. This victory marks the point where the rebels' declared purpose as freedom fighters seeking to overthrow the slave regime begins to fall apart. Freedom was within their grasp, requiring only a crossing of the Alps. But at the last moment, Spartacus turned back and led the rebels south again. Ancient authors suggest that the warriors, emboldened by their victories, especially the recent one over Gaius Cassius Longinus's army, no longer wanted to leave. They didn't want a quiet life beyond the Alps. They wanted to continue looting the rich lands and use the wealth to establish their state in Sicily, which had many slaves. So the rebel army headed south again. Importantly, the army traveled light. Spartacus ordered all prisoners to be killed and all pack animals to be slaughtered. He also temporarily stopped accepting new recruits into the army to avoid being slowed down. This behavior hardly aligns with his image in the series as a freedom fighter seeking equality and the recognition of human life as the highest value. I would like to particularly focus on Julius Caesar, who gets a lot of screen time in the third season. It's quite clear that Caesar could not have been an infiltrator in Spartacus's army. Such activities were far beneath his status. However, the series creators were not the first to inexplicably insert Caesar into the story of the Third Servile War. The series creators were probably inspired by an Italian novel from the 19th century, which I have already mentioned. In the so-called historical novel Spartacus by Raffaello Giovagnoli, Caesar is also mentioned, but the author takes even more liberties. In the novel, Caesar is acquainted with Spartacus even before the uprising. He accidentally learns about the impending conspiracy and uses it for his political career. In this novel, Caesar even warned Spartacus that the plot has been discovered. According to Giovagnoli, Spartacus had gained his freedom before the uprising, but was so outraged that his fellow gladiators remained enslaved that he planned their escape, which Caesar then learned about. In reality, Caesar had no connection to Spartacus's rebellion. Even after the revolt was suppressed, he tried to avoid mentioning it, as did many Romans of the time. Spartacus's name became a kind of taboo. However, there is one reference to a real event involving Caesar in the series.
Cilicians cannot be trusted. You're familiar with their kind. I bear the displeasure of their company.
In 75 BC, Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates while on his way to Rhodes to study rhetoric. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents, to which Caesar laughed and said they didn't know who he was, offering to pay 50 talents instead. Ancient authors vividly describe Gaius's time in captivity. He joked with the pirates and recited his own poems to them. Once, he even jokingly told them they would all be hanged. After 38 days, the ransom arrived, and Caesar was released. He immediately gathered a small fleet, pursued the pirates, captured them, and personally organized their crucifixion. Thus, the only historically accurate element in the series about Caesar is his disdain for pirates. In the end, after all the chaos caused by Spartacus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man of his time, took on the role of savior of the Republic. In the series, his adult son Tiberius is a completely fictional character. In reality, Crassus's children were much younger during Spartacus's rebellion and could not have participated in the war. Crassus had immense wealth and political influence, but he yearned for military glory without which he felt he lacked the proper respect in Rome. While the series emphasizes Crassus's wealth, it does not explain how he acquired it. Crassus began his career under Sulla, who established a dictatorship in Rome before Caesar. During Sulla's rule, Crassus took advantage of the opportunities provided by the regime and became extremely wealthy through proscriptions. Proscriptions were lists of individuals to be persecuted. By eliminating his adversaries, dictator Sulla confiscated their property, a portion of which was awarded to those who helped capture the traitors of Rome. Being included in a proscription list was equivalent to having a bounty placed on one's head, with the reward being paid out of the individual's own confiscated assets. Essentially, it was legalized plunder. Marcus Licinius Crassus actively exploited this situation, growing his wealth by seizing the property of those who fell out of favor with the authorities. Being an enterprising and ambitious individual, Crassus then invested his newly acquired wealth in real estate. These investments not only multiplied his fortune many times over, but also allowed him to gain enormous influence. Crassus commanded 6 legions in addition to the 2 consular legions, but his first battle against Spartacus ended in defeat. Crassus sent 2 legions under Marcus Mummius to execute a flanking maneuver, attacking Spartacus's army from the rear to keep them under pressure but avoiding direct confrontation. However, Mummius disobeyed orders and attacked Spartacus, seeking glory on the battlefield. The result was a brutal defeat of both legions and the loss of both Aquilas, a tremendous disgrace. An Aquila is a battle standard of the legions in the form of an eagle. This battle is depicted in a highly distorted manner in the series. In the show, Crassus's son leads the troops, and pirates help Spartacus to defeat them, which did not happen in reality. However, the subsequent episode with Decimation is a historical fact. The morale of the Roman army was low due to constant defeats by the runaway gladiators and issues with recruiting volunteers, as a war against slaves promised neither trophies nor loot. Risking one's life to save Rome was noble, but returning from war with some spoils was even better. As shown in the series, To restore discipline and authority, Crassus took measures. He conducted a decimation of Mummius's fleeing soldiers, executing every 10th man. At least 500 men were subjected to decimation, not just 50 as shown in the series. Punishments in the Roman army were indeed harsh to maintain discipline. In 340 BC, Consul Titus Manlius Torquatus executed his son for engaging in battle without his order. Titus Manlius the Younger was tied to a stake and an executioner beheaded him. This occurred even despite his victory in the skirmish. Therefore, the scene where Crassus's son, Tiberius, asks his father to save his lover from execution is absurd in the context of the time, even if he had been involved in those battles. The decimation worked, and after it, victories on the battlefield consistently favored Crassus. Spartacus had no choice but to move to Sicily. More than half of the island's population were slaves, and each was a potential soldier for Spartacus's army. The so-called Crassus defense line was indeed constructed. A deep trench, fortified with a high earthen wall and a sharp palisade, spanned the entire Rhegium Peninsula. Crassus hoped to cut off Spartacus's access to food and to starve his army. It was at this point in the real history of the Third Servile War that Cilician pirates appeared. Spartacus had arranged with them to transport his men to Sicily, but the pirate ships did not appear at the agreed-upon time. According to the most common version, Crassus had bribed them. The betrayal by the pirates is also mentioned in the series, albeit in a very distorted manner. Florus mentioned that there were some attempts at raft and shipbuilding by the rebels as a means to escape, but that Crassus took unspecified measures to ensure the rebels could not cross to Sicily, and their efforts were abandoned. Surrounded, Spartacus's army began to run out of food supplies. They made a desperate decision to break through the Crassus defense line. The first attempt failed, and the rebels retreated. Ultimately, after many maneuvers and tricks, Spartacus managed to breach the Roman fortifications. The main forces of his army distracted the Romans with their attack, and a small detachment managed to fill the trench, break through the palisade, and escape the encirclement. Spartacus then headed for the port city of Brundisium to seize ships, but he could not take the city. At the city's walls, the runaway slaves were met by the forces of Consul Marcus Terentius Lucullus. Crassus pressed from the rear, and Pompey's legions approached from the north. First, Crassus defeated Gannicus's detachment, and then his army confronted Spartacus's forces at the river Salaris. According to Plutarch, before the decisive battle, Spartacus was brought a war horse, but he killed it with his sword, saying, "If we win, I'll have plenty of good horses, but if we lose, I won't need one." Spartacus and his best warriors charged forward, attempting to reach Crassus. They nearly succeeded, killing 2 centurions from Crassus's personal guard. However, unable to reach their target, Spartacus fell. Without their leader, the rebel army could not effectively resist the Romans and was completely defeated. As I mentioned earlier, Spartacus's army included not only slaves but also various impoverished free people who had no slave brands. While Spartacus was successful, they enjoyed looting the territories with him. But when he died, they quickly scattered. Since many did not have brands, they avoided punishment for their past crimes as members of the rebel army. About 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way between Capua and Rome. Several groups of surviving rebels continued to cause disturbances for a while, but they were soon dealt with. One of the largest such groups was defeated by Gnaeus Pompeius, who then claimed the glory of the final victory, much to Crassus's dismay. Although Crassus managed to get his achievements recognized, their importance was greatly diminished. So, the scene in the series where Crassus voluntarily gives the laurels to Pompey did not happen in reality. Crassus undoubtedly had built a remarkable career and amassed an enormous fortune, but he always felt he lacked recognition for his military achievements. His victory over Spartacus was not considered particularly noteworthy because it was won against an army of slaves. Toward the end of his life, Crassus sought to fill this void. He believed that a victory over Parthia would finally grant him the military glory he desired. He invested a significant portion of his wealth in this campaign, selling several hundred highly skilled slaves and a substantial portion of his real estate. Ignoring the existing treaty between Parthia and Rome, Crassus launched a military campaign against Parthia. He was confident he could quickly recoup his losses and enhance his influence and popularity, to the point of equaling that of Pompey and Caesar. In Rome, Crassus's plans met with strong opposition. Parthia was not seen as a threat to Rome's interests, and a successful campaign would dangerously boost an ambitious Crassus. Crassus's enemies argued that the war was unjust, breaking the peace established by Pompey's treaty without legitimate cause. Crassus invested nearly half his fortune in this venture, carrying a substantial amount of his wealth in gold, stored in several chests. He needed to carry this money to maintain his reputation as a wealthy man, use it for bribes, suppress potential rebellions, and pay his soldiers and mercenaries. After Crassus's defeat, all the gold he transported fell into Parthian hands. The Parthians melted the gold and poured it down Crassus's throat, emphasizing his greed. This ignominious death was remembered far more frequently than his victory over Spartacus. However, the name of Spartacus in turn has endured for over 2,000 years. Sports clubs are still named after him, and books and movies continue to be made about his life. In the 19th century, Karl Marx in his writings called Spartacus the most splendid human in the whole of ancient history, and a great general, a noble character, a real representative of the ancient proletariat. Though Spartacus was not truly a liberator of the people and did not intend to overthrow the slave-owning system, he refused to accept his fate. He fought for his life and repeatedly demonstrated his talents as a military leader on the battlefield. Spartacus also proved himself to be a just leader who shared all spoils equally among his comrades. Thank you for watching the video to the end. I hope you had a good time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You'll discover plenty of other captivating videos waiting for you there.